kind of go live. I think that's when it lets
I
me
could
know how
I
many
could
people
watch
are
it
in
on
the
my
stream.
phone
So
with the
I
volume.
guess you can. Yeah. So we'll kind of see how many people kind of jump in through this. If not, they'll have the joy of watching this as a recording. I tried to get a few of my friends to kind of make sure that they had a chance to jump on tonight and join us. And even reached out to a bit of the inspiration to that, my old man. So I'll kind of talk a little bit about that too as we go into this.
Oh, really?
Go ahead. Said just want to say something?
No. Are we live? Hey.
We are now live. Yeah. As we're kind of stumbling over my own words. I'm sure I'll get a comment about that. So welcome back to the channel, everybody. This is the first live stream. Doing in several weeks, and RJ and Jake were not able to join us for this one. They were invited, but they're definitely going to be able to watch and comment later. I think Jake and RJ will be back soon with another topic on a project that he's been working on personally. I think maybe as soon as next week. So I wanted to welcome into my channel someone that reached out to me to be on his channel last month to kind of go over the 1964 Topps Giants set. That would be Dan's from Dan's Vintage Baseball PC. So Dan, welcome to my channel and welcome to the live stream. We have some people that are jumping into the chat tonight, starting with, we have Jason here saying hi to both of us. Local guy Jason to where I'm at here. So
Yes.
first YouTuber, or first guy that met me, I guess, as a YouTuber in the community.
It's in Strongsville. Indeed, we had lunch together, and he drove us to lunch. So he was great to hang with that. And I think I'm pretty sure he's in our Airbnb for the National.
Oh wow!
There's like 14
awesome.
content creators, I guess they call us, in
the same house. Oh man, it's going to be a pretty busy house.
I just want to get like one of the lower floors because, as the old guy, probably one of the oldest guys in the house, I don't want to have to walk up the stairs every day to get to stuff. Anyway,
apparently Jason is in the hose. I don't know what that means, but he corrected it, said house. I don't know what that means. You're out and back, Jason. You have to stay where the hoses are.
I've already charted out where the beer distributor is nearest to the house. So we'll be ready to go.
It might be needed. Yeah.
Yeah. No.
Dad, tell us a little bit about your channel. What are some of the things you like to present on and talk about on your channel, and what are you collecting these days?
I am, I'm not a team collector, but I do have a team collection of various teams. Like I do the Yankees a little bit, and Brooklyn Dodgers from the golden era of the Dodgers. But I do a lot of player collecting, and I do set collecting. So I kind of do a little bit of everything. The channel started about a year ago. In fact, it was the first week of June, and it's been great. I mean, I'm basically doing a series of different types of shows. I did an SGC reveal that I posted today. I do like stories about the card shows that I go to, but what I feature the most are interviews with super collectors of particular players or teams or like like groups of players kind of thing. And so I bring in the super collectors. We go over, and you and I did a set. I've done a couple of sets too. We go over the history of the player or the set or whatever, and then we go through cards, show slides, talk about it. The best thing for me to do is to do like a little bio at the beginning, and then like put bits and pieces of the bio as we go through the rest of the cards. I found that that's like the worked the best. Oh, and Orlando, as we see, is here. Mm-hmm. Thank you, Orlando.
Yeah, Orlando's fantastic. He's been on our channel too.
Strong Phil. One of the best guys in the hobby. I think everybody agrees with that. But he was so nice in the early days of my channel. He agreed to do a show when I had 100 subscribers, and it was a great show. We did it on like the Cuban Stars, going all the way back to the beginning, and then going through like this 50s, 60s, 70s. So that was a really nice show. Yeah, I mean that's kind of what I try to do is like bring on a guest, go through something in particular that they have a super collection of. So that's what the channel has been so far, and everything so far has worked out pretty well. I kind of think.
Yeah,
Yeah,
your recordings are really informative too. I learn a lot when
yeah.
I listen to them.
Well, I'm a baseball
What inspired
history.
you to start? What
Say it
inspired
again.
you to start a channel? Yeah.
I started the channel at the beginning of June, so it'll be a year. I'm going to do my first live stream sometime in the middle of June, and you, Mitchell, are invited because you were on a show. I'm going to try to bring
Oh,
back
fantastic.
everybody who can come to do like a little update and talk about where they're going with their collections or their channels or whatever. So it's going to be like kind of a 1 year anniversary celebration mixed with like bring up to date with everybody who's been on the show. So really excited about that one too.
Well, I think what kind of inspired me to get started 2 years ago now is that as I was watching a lot of people, I realized like,
Hmm.
I have something to say. Like I have a perspective to bring in. I have some knowledge to bring in because, like you, I think I kind of consider myself an amateur baseball historian and have been reading about baseball since I was a teenager, and been collecting ever since I was a kid. So that's really kind of what brought me to it. And it's like, all right, let me give it a shot. And I think for the most part, it's been pretty well received. And every now and then you get a comment, you're like, wow, where did that one come from? That came out of left field. I guess they really didn't like me, but not for everybody. They don't have to watch all my videos, and that's totally cool. But it's mostly been extremely positive.
Yeah, no, that's one of the great things about having had you on my channel is because you are like a history guy. We were able to go through the different players that we were profiling, and it was really, really interesting. And that's kind of like what I like to do with everyone. So that kind of worked out. Certainly going to hopefully have you back on at some point to do whatever. But for tonight, it's your channel, and I'm happy and very appreciative that you invited me on.
So, Jason, you're hilarious because the Cardinals and the White Sox are just like about the worst things in the world right now. but,
But
but thank you.
I
But
have
it
a
didn't
good.
stop me from wearing my Albert Pujols jersey for the purposes of this night's live stream. So what kind of inspired this is Dan offered to be on my channel, and I was trying to think about like what is like a topic that I could kind of do that's a little bit different. I feel like I've seen every set, in some ways, although you can never probably capture all of them, but the good majority of the sets have been kind of captured at some point. So I'm just kind of doing my favorite ones when they come up. But um, we, there's like different takes we could kind of take on the hobby, right? We could talk about players, we could talk about teams. In this situation, I was kind of inspired by a book I read probably about 20 years ago, and I just showed Dan this not too long ago, but it's called The Teammates. It's about Bobby Doerr, Johnny Pesky, Dom DiMaggio, and Ted Williams around their friendship over the decades. It was written shortly after Ted Williams had passed, actually, and it was at that time the other three were still alive. So which kind of made me. We're not doing the Red Sox tonight, but it kind of inspired me. What would be kind of an interesting team to cover, kind of from the vintage era that I'd kind of been interested in, and I didn't have to look very far, kind of think about like I could easily do the White Sox teams, but I feel like we've covered those in other shows I've done, but haven't really like seen much on two topics that are related to this: baseball during the war years of World War II, and the St. Louis Cardinals during the 1940s, which were a powerhouse team that often gets overlooked. Like, I think during that decade, people look towards after the war is over and integration begins, and the Dodgers start getting good, and the Yankees obviously were a powerhouse through that decade as well. But the Cardinals were something to behold. And that's where I wanted to kind of talk a little bit about those teams and the major stars that were on there too. Um, so that's what kind of brought me to the topic, I think, as kind of an inspiration tonight. And so I invited Dan on, and I think we kind of both jumped at the topic to kind of get started with it. So, Dan, when you think about the baseball play during the World War II years, what kind of comes to mind for you?
Well, I mean, for the most part, it's waste. It's the waste of some players' prime years, and we'll get into one of those particular players tonight. But you're talking about guys like Ted Williams and Feller and Spahn and people like that. But
Hmm.
nobody thinks about the fact that the Cardinals lost Enos Slaughter for 3 years, and we'll talk about some of his numbers before and after. Um, and that kind of took away prime years of many of the players who who served. And I feel like it was a different game from 42 to 46. It was a different game. And the war years are known for, a lot of older guys who shouldn't really have been playing anymore were used because they needed bodies, which is funny. We'll talk about Pepper Martin, who played in 1944 after having been retired for like 4 years. And then young guys too. So you get like Joe Nuxhall as a 15-year-old coming in to pitch for the Reds. So you get, the baseball wasn't as good. And you get two years in a row, there's a pitcher who's the MVP, Hal Newhouser. You get the St. Louis Browns in the World Series. You get Greenberg coming back from the war in 1945, playing like a couple of months, and then, bring in Tigers World Championship. So there's a lot of historical stuff about it. And, I should shout out Mike, the Mike History Collector. He's the autograph guy who's been on my channel. I can't remember the names of people's channels sometimes. I'm sorry. But he does a series that talks about an individual player and their, what their sacrifice was when they went in the war. And a lot of these guys came back with injuries. They came back with, they couldn't hear out of one of their ears. Obviously trauma was part of it too. So the war really kind of affected baseball in many different ways that really weren't apparent until years later.
Yeah, I think you touched on some of the points. Like, I think we all kind of think about like the years that were lost by some of the key players during that era. We'll touch on some of those players, I think, tonight too, as it relates to the Cardinals. I think when people think about those teams, they kind of minimize their accomplishments. They're like, well, they had Musial for all that time. Well, they didn't. Right. And so like Slaughter was gone for 3 years, and they were kind of stretched a little thin, just as much as some other teams were too during that era, without question. So, kind of thinking about the Cardinals' success during that decade, and just kind of giving everybody an introduction, they had winning seasons from 1938 all the way through 1953. And these weren't just like third, fourth place finishes by and large. These were like first and second place finishes for most of them. And then they start kind of tapering off a bit in the 50s, which we'll kind of touch base a little bit on too. Much of their success started in the 1930s. So we want to kind of talk a little bit about the Gas House Gang after sort of their brief success in the 1920s. The team kind of got a little bit bad again, and they started kind of rebuilding during the 1930s, during the Depression.
So I'm going to show off two cards of two players who are instrumental in the early success. The first card is a 1923 W572 of Rogers Hornsby. Hornsby took the Cardinals to the World Series championships in the 20s, but he was a bit of a personality issue, and at one point they traded him, and they traded him straight up for this guy, Frankie Frisch, who will not only be one of the key players in the Gas House Gang, but also would manage the team later on. So that's kind of where the history starts with the Cardinals in the 30s. They win the 1931 World Series over the very heavily favored Philadelphia A's because of this man, Pepper Martin, who batted .500 in the series and made a catch in the last inning of Game 7 to ultimately save the World Series. And he's underappreciated. I think he had a shorter career because he was one of those guys that played at 110% and ran into walls and dove for balls and got injured too often. Pepper Martin is with the team throughout the 30s, becomes a coach in the early 40s, and then comes back and plays in 1944. So
because they were shorter players.
Interesting player. So the
Mm-hmm.
31 team, I have this card, which I got at Strongsville. Gabby Street was the manager of the Cardinals throughout the early 30s. In fact, is the manager of the Gas House Gang, and he ends up never managing again. He wins World Series titles and somehow or another never manages again. In fact, this card is a Z-Nut card, which means he was managing in the minor leagues And this is either 35 and 36 is when he managed. The name of the team is the Mission Reds out in California. So I don't know what Gabby Street did to
I
get.
think Frisch got the job. I think they moved him to player
Frisch
manager,
being
right?
player manager. In fact, I think
Yeah.
I'm sorry. Frisch may have been the player manager in 34, but Street was definitely the manager in 31. And then so they have the 34 championship, and they're very good. And then Dean gets hurt in the 36 All-Star game. And some of the players from the Gas House gang kind of fade out, like Martin gets older and hurt. But you got him. You got Medwick comes in. You got Bottomley. You got Ripper Collins. So you've got good players throughout the 30s. And then
got a few of them.
They end up getting this guy, the guy with the bat,
as you mentioned. Yeah.
Yep, Johnny Mize. This is my only card. I have Johnny Mize. I have all his flagships, but this is the only Mize card that I have with him in a Cardinals uniform. There aren't that many of them. But yeah, this is a 1941 double play. Of course, the interesting story about the double play set, which only existed for one season, is that it was totally unauthorized. None of the players got paid. And Johnny Mize himself sued the bubblegum company that put these cards out, and that was the end of them. But this is Johnny Mize in a St. Louis uniform. So I've done a lot of talking.
I appreciate it. Yeah. Thank you, Alex, for putting your video aside to be able to join us this evening and watch the video about the 40 Cardinals. Yeah, like as you mentioned, like Mize was like a big signing or a big player kind of coming up for them, and but he didn't last very long on that team into the early 40s, as they kind of moved him on unexpectedly after the 41 season. So that was like the last season he was with the St. Louis Cardinals.
Deep dive into this because
what'd you learn? Yeah,
one of my early shows in my channel was my Johnny Mize collection. I did a deep dive into Mize, but I did a deep dive into the trade. And so what happens with the Cardinals in the 20s and 30s, and this is really sort of historically important for them moving forward, is that Branch Rickey becomes general manager, and the owner is I forget the owner's name, begins with a B. It's like whatever his name it is, but the two of them together put together a farm system. And back in the 20s and 30s, you would just pull players from different teams and have to buy them or trade them, whatever. But what they did is they set up like an affiliation with certain clubs. And so they would put their players on clubs, and they had the right to get them from those clubs. So they ended up creating like what is very, the sort of basic version of what exists today in terms of farm system. Minor league teams that are affiliated, and you call the guy up and all that. So so in the late 30s, what happens is they've got a group of players that are ready to start coming up. And Mize, who in 39 or 40 has like an MVP quality season, has kind of a down year in 41, and then holds out and asks for more money. So they just traded him. There were winter meetings back then in 41, and they went into the winter meetings trying to trade him to a variety of different teams. And ultimately, they took a terrible package of players from the Giants, two guys that never played for them.
Don't even really know about anymore.
Yeah, just guys that were just throwaways. They literally gave. It's one of the worst trades in baseball history that nobody ever thinks about. But the reason that it didn't really hurt them is that they had such a good amount of players in the farm that were coming up that they didn't really need them. So Mize's first year with the Giants, the first year that the Cardinals don't have Mize, they win 106 games or whatever in 42, and they win the World Series. So it's an interesting bad trade that didn't end up really hurting them that much. But if you think about it, if Johnny Mize was on the Cardinals in the late 40s, it would have been a different story.
Been a very different story. Yeah.
Yep.
And you mentioned the 41 season in the 42. Well, there's a kind of a good reason for maybe why they still stayed dominant. And there's a certain maybe best National League player of all time, he or Willie Mays, that was a rookie in 1941, but he was a pitcher. He started as a pitcher, hurt his arm in the minor leagues, and they converted him to a position player.
Yep.
And that is none other than Stan Musial.
Yep.
Which I think kind of maybe brings us in a little bit to our slideshow too. I can probably add that on a little bit too, as we kind of start talking about the teams from the 40s here. Before we did that, I wanted to kind of share this image. Yeah, it says 1950, but this is actually something that's in my collection. This was, my dad's here. He might remember giving this to me as we found it. This was a giveaway at Sportsman Park in 1950 when my father went to a game with his brother and my grandfather. So this is from 1950. I scanned it obviously on here for the purposes of like today's slideshow, but it has a lot of the players that we're going to be talking about. Some of the key players from the 1940s are all pictured in here. We have Red Shandy, who we'll talk about in a little bit. Enos Slaughter was still at the team. Marty Marion was still at the team, and Stan Musial as well. So, but I wanted to kind of like use that as kind of a backdrop, and it's also the backdrop of a lot of my pictures. But as we kind of talk about the team as it transitioned into the mid 40s, we had, some of these guys that were there at the beginning of that decade. Enos Slaughter came up in 38, and we had Mize still with the team. And, for a little bit while, Medwick was still kind of lingering around the team before he got moved around. Then we had in Marty Marion kind of was brought in and joined the team for a little bit. And then we had, after that, we had the man. The man joined us, Stan Musial in 1941, and obviously, helped the team kind of going thereafter. But I want to back a little bit. I think we might want to talk a little bit about Enos Slaughter, because he left the team after 42 to enroll in the military service, where he actually was promoted to a sergeant and actually was teaching physical fitness. So he actually, I don't think he saw any action during the war, but he was obviously, I guess, vital to kind of getting the soldiers fit before they went off for action. But Enos, so he's kind of an interesting character, and maybe we can talk about Marion as well, because they were kind of the first of this group from the 40s to kind of come up and debut. Dan, if you want, which one you want to start with there?
Well, let's talk about Slaughter, because I think Slaughter's interesting. This is the card that you have, the 48 Bowman. Which is a wonderful card. This is, I guess, called his rookie, even though at that point he'd been a major league player for multiple years. And this is his beautiful.
Mine, so.
This is his beautiful 53 Bowman, the classic kneeling pose with the beautiful blue sky behind him.
Yeah, I think we both have copies of it. Yeah,
it's a striking card, and so
which was his last year with the Cardinals too. It was 53.
Yeah, 53. Yeah, so he comes up, I think, in 39, maybe plays a little bit, and then becomes a regular. And he's one of those guys that, if you look at his numbers, he's unbelievable. I mean, one year, I think it was 42, he finished second in the MVP voting. I think he led the league in hits and runs and batted like 328 or something. And so he's MVP, second in MVP, 42. Then he goes into the service, 43, 44, 45, comes back at 46, and has another amazing season where he drives in 130 runs, and I think he came in third in MVP voting that season. So those 3 years in between were years that Slaughter would have been getting 200 hits, batting 330, and driving in 100 runs. And if you look at his numbers, I think he finished his career with about 2,300 hits. There's a pretty good argument that Slaughter gets 3,000 hits, I think, if he doesn't play in the war. But we'll get into this later. There's two things that Slaughter has talked about historically. One, of course, is the mad dash, and we'll talk about that later. The other is allegations that he was one of the negative, people that was claiming that they were going to boycott playing the Dodgers, and because of Jackie Robinson. And I think historically that has become something that, it was in the Ken Burns documentary. He's the one that they allege, spiked Jackie Robinson and intentionally and hurt him. And the reality is that people who were there at the time say, yeah, he did spike Jackie Robinson, but that's the way he played. That's the way Slaughter played. And he didn't cut his leg open like they said in the documentary. He hit him in the leg, and it wasn't a good thing, obviously, but it wasn't something that was done because he was a racist. And in fact, I did some research on this also this week. One of Enos Slaughter's best friends for life was Monty Irvin. And Monty Irvin, of course, being one of the pioneering African-American players for the Giants, Monty Irvin was the person who pushed for Slaughter to get into the Hall of Fame in the mid-1980s. And Enos Slaughter was also personal coach for Lou Brock during the 60s when Lou Brock was becoming,
Right.
a Hall of Fame caliber player. So I think the legend that Enos Slaughter was an awful racist guy is really, really unfair. And hopefully at
Doesn't
some
tell the
point,
whole story. Yeah.
it'll be sort of known, more some of the things in Ken Burns' documentary about other players, Ty Cobb in particular, are proven to be historically inaccurate. So that's kind of, I think, what Slaughter suffers from. He also suffers from, he is in the Hall of Fame, but he's thought of as sort of a lower tier Hall of Famer. But if you look at his career, absolutely not. I mean, multiple
10-time All-Star.
Yeah, 10 times, 10 straight years All-Star, 2 top 5 finishes, or maybe even more than 2 top 5 finishes in the MVP voting. Some fantastic seasons where he led the league in, all different kinds of stuff.
5 top 10 finishes. Yep.
Yeah. And then he's not a power hitter, and that kind of takes away from him. And then he won 4 World Series titles, 2 with the Cardinals and 2 with the Yankees. So he was a winner.
Yeah, I think some of his greatness, I think, is kind of lost a bit because he did play before, like some of the post-war vintage cards that I think, like at least in our sort of like little community, just love, right? The cards from the late 40s into the 50s and 60s. I mean, he wasn't like a superstar, I think, for much of that period. He was still a good player that contributed. Same way, kind of Johnny Mize. I think he kind of fits in that kind of category as well, too. I think they're kind of afterthoughts a bit kind of in the vintage community. And I think part of like we wanted to bring attention to those guys is that they shouldn't be in some ways because these guys were big stars, for the period of time prior to World War II and some through parts of it. What I thought also kind of interesting about Enos Slaughter, this is like, something I thought was unique, but not sure what to make of it, but he was also married 5 times, which I thought was kind of interesting too, which kind of made me wonder, like, was he kind of like maybe a difficult guy to kind of get along with? I kind of wondered a little bit too, and I don't want to make any certain assertions, but I wonder if that had something to do maybe with like why he had to wait so long to get into the Hall of Fame.
He played until his, like, I think he retired when he was like 43 or something. So he was one of those lifers. And lifer major leaguer, they're always on the road. Some of them like women who they've never met before. Some of them, Mickey Mantle is obviously well known for it, but he wasn't the only one. So I could see, a lot of these guys were married multiple times. Of course, Stan Musial is the complete opposite. Stan Musial was married to, I think it was his high school sweetheart for something like 71 years. But he's sort of a player and a person who was very unique in his, being just perfect.
I always think of it kind of like the Jimmy Stewart of baseball.
Yeah.
Like everybody loved him and didn't have a bad word to say about him.
Yeah, there's a guy on Twitter who's been doing a bunch of Stan Musial posts in the last couple of weeks, talking about like all the quotes that people have had about him, and it's all just glowing stuff because he was the kind of person who people said glowing stuff about. So you got the 48 Bowman. Here's the 49, which I'm big.
Beautiful. Yeah, let me go take down this so people can see that a little bit more closely.
Yeah,
that's a card I've been trying to target a little bit too for my personal collection as well.
My target,
the 49.
My target with Musial is the Leaf card, which I also love, but I've never been able to find a copy that managed to be. See, this is a 1.5, which I don't know how it's a 1.5. The centering is perfect. I don't even know why. I mean, I should just crack this out and send it back, and they'll give me like a 4 because it's that good. But I got it at a price of a 1.5, so that's a good thing. And then his other Bowman cards are the 51. I'm sorry.
The 52 is an amazing card.
I have a 51.
It really is. Yeah.
This is another beautiful card. I think this is one of the most underrated cards in the hobby. This should be in everyone's collection. And then the last one, which
is one of the big 3 of that set, though. Yeah, for sure. But they're
some people
far behind the other 2.
This is some people's favorite 53 Bowman card because it's got the smile and the dugout, and it's just classic sort of Stan from that era. And I'll show one more of Musial, which is the red.
That's the other one everyone loves from the 50s, right? Yeah.
He doesn't have any Topps cards until 58, All-Star, and his Bowman cards stop at 53. So if you want a 54 Musial, it's got to be this. And this is also a fantastic card. So that's a bit of my Stan Musial collection.
Got a little bit of a usual reading recommendation there from the Baseball Time Traveler.
Nice.
Thank you. Yeah. I read a book about him a few years ago. I can't remember what it was called, but it was a wonderful read too. Transitioning a bit to actually, so they were, pull up my numbers here. So they won obviously the World Series we mentioned in 42. They in 43 they were also in first place and went to the World Series and lost to the Yankees. So they beat them 1 year, four games to 1, and lost the next year 4 games to 1.
Yep.
In 44 they returned to the World Series, and their MVP that season when they played the St. Louis Browns, which was the only year the Browns ever made the World Series while they were in St. Louis, was Marty Marion.
Mm-hmm.
And he was kind of an interesting player too when you kind of look at his career, because I think when we look back at him in history, he's kind of a little bit of an afterthought, I think, in some ways, because he's not a Hall of Fame player. He's kind of not even like in the Hall of Very Good. And that had everything to do with his injuries, because during his time, he was the shortstop.
Yeah.
He was like the guy, the image everybody looked to for the shortstop. In fact, his nickname was the Octopus because he was able to field all these balls. And they just thought he had so many arms and tentacles that would not allow balls through. His other nickname was the Mr. Shortstop. So he was kind of like the quintessential best player at that position during that era, which I thought was kind of interesting because it was kind of like an afterthought when I kind of thought of Marty Marion and like, you want an MVP? Like, oh, okay. His numbers weren't as good as some of his teammates, but okay.
No,
I think he was just beloved during his time period.
That's one
8
of the
straight
things.
All-Star appearances and part of 3 World Series teams. So.
He won the 44 MVP, but it's one of those ones that people look back on and they say, well, if you look at the numbers, it should Musial finished I think 5th, and he was probably had the biggest WAR, but of course they didn't have WAR back then. Mm-hmm. WAR back then meant World War II, but Marion, I think, was a leader in the clubhouse. He was one of those guys that everybody could rely on. And like you said, he apparently had like really long arms, and he was able
like 6'2".
And he was tall too. Yeah, he was also tall.
He was tall for that time.
Yeah, shortstops were short back then. So he was kind of a unique player and a winner, obviously. And he later on becomes the player manager in 1951. And he, as you mentioned, he had injuries. So he was a player manager, but he didn't play at all that season because he was hurt. So then he wanted to come back and play the following season, and they didn't want him to play. They wanted to only manage. So he ends up moving across town and becoming the manager of the St. Louis Browns in 1952. So
he tried to be a bit of a player manager too, but didn't appear much on the field.
Browns
right?
In 52, and he played a little bit.
That's an awesome card from 52. Yeah.
Yeah. Look at the.
When I was looking up cards of Marty Marion, I'm like, that's one I want to get at some point. Look at the Browns, emblem on his jersey. It's so pronounced.
It's so fantastic.
Yeah.
And I got this card graded recently and did my SGC reveal, which went out yesterday. Or was it this morning? I think it was this morning. This card was in it. I just got this back, and this is another absolutely beautiful card. You see the little thing on his sleeve there,
a little devil patch. I love it.
Got the stadium behind him. I'm pretty sure this is Polo Grounds. Alex, if Alex is still in the chat, I'm
probably.
Sure,
because I think this is only a couple were taken at Ebbets Field, and they were Dodgers.
So Marty Marion.
Well, actually, no, they were American League teams, so it would have been Yankee Stadium. Before somebody else corrects us.
I don't. There's some Yankee Stadium shots. I know Al Rosen was the one where you could see the classic Yankee Stadium. I showed that before, but so Marion is like the rock in the middle of the infield, the team leader, the everybody loves him kind of guy, and he's solid, and that's part of the reason he won the. Back then, it was less so about stats and more about the team won, and this was our leader kind of thing.
It's kind of interesting fact about him too, and more to do with the team he was coaching or managing at the time. He was the last manager of the St. Louis Browns. He didn't move to Baltimore. He was not retained. And he actually moved to the south side of Chicago to be their manager for a couple of years, as the owner also moved over to the south side of Chicago. And Bill Veeck sold the team to Baltimore and later purchased the Chicago White Sox. So
Oh, I should mention also, I think Marion was a really smart guy too with his money, and he ended up getting part ownership, I believe, in a couple of minor league teams throughout the years. So, and I think he lived comfortably. I mean, this is an era when guys were making, $16,000 a year or whatever it was. I think that was the number that Mize came in asking for when they decided they were going to trade him. So he ended up being really smart with his money and owning parts of minor league teams throughout the years. So smart guy also.
All right, so they all won the World Series in 44, and in 45 they were second place to the Chicago Cubs. Actually, so the Chicago Cubs made their last World Series appearance until 2016 in that season, and lost to the Detroit Tigers, as you mentioned. Hank Greenberg coming back, also Tommy Bridges coming back from the War II and joining the team during that time had an impact, obviously, on deepening their bench at that point. But also in 45, there was a young second baseman
Yep.
that eventually kind of came up after he spent a little bit time in the military service, but had to be discharged because of an eye injury that he sustained when he was a much younger person, that actually resulted in him becoming a switch hitter. So I guess the story kind of goes is he was like in the trade, and he always screwed around, hitting from both sides of the plate. And there was like some injury that some accident that actually resulted in something puncturing in his eye, which he thought he was going to lose vision in, but he didn't. But it did impact his ability to be able to easily pick up the curveball when he was batting right-handed. So then he decided to start also batting from the left side of the plate too, and that resulted in him being a switch hitter, and thereby obviously continuing to pursue his Major League Baseball career and debuting with the St. Louis Cardinals in 45. And God, he didn't finish being a St. Louis Cardinal until his death in some capacity. He wore that uniform forever, and as a coach, even up toward his death. So
they traded him to the Giants, and then the Giants traded him to the Braves. So Shane Deans ended up getting a world championship with the Braves in 57, but then he came back to the Cardinals and stayed there until he was.
Yeah, I got one of his later career cards, with right when he was at the Braves right there. So Milwaukee. Yeah.
So this was the last card that I got to complete my 1948 Bowman set in all SGC slabs. This was not an easy card to get. It's his rookie card.
It's a little pricey.
I think it's a high number, and this is a 3, and I spent $300 on eBay to get this, which is a lot. I mean, I think it's the second or third most I spent on any card in this set. No, it's not. That's not true. So I spent on Berra. I spent a lot of money too. But yeah, so I ended up. This is the last card. This completed my all SGC slab 1948 Bowman set, and so this is kind of a special card to me. And of course,
it was the most recent edition from me. I picked that one up.
This
this
gorgeous card from the 53 Bowman set. The he's batting left-handed here, and he's staring down whoever is allegedly pitching to him. But of course, it's his post shot. Yeah. Oh, there you go. And I think
that was my first Bowman color. Yeah.
I don't know that what stadium this is. It doesn't look like the Polo Grounds, but it should be. I don't know. I mean, there's red seats up here.
It's got to be. Right. I'm not exactly sure. Alex is somewhere in this room. He probably could let us know for sure. So he's probably studied that card longer than we have. Yeah.
There's I see another card on there that you have that I don't, that I've been looking for.
Yeah, Billy Southworth.
Billy Southworth should be mentioned here.
Because you wonder why I have a Brave on there, right? Well, there's not really any, I couldn't find a card of him managing with the St. Louis Cardinals, and he was their manager for the most part of the early 40s. So successful, obviously. He's actually in the Hall of Fame as a manager.
Yeah.
And that's, I think, one of his only cards that you can easily obtain. He gets them when he was a player, but they're much older and much more expensive.
They're oddball sets in the 20s. I've tried to get him because, as you see, he's on the Braves, and one of the teams that I collect is the 1948 Braves, and I did a show on that. At the end of, it's either at the end, I think it's the end of 47, or no, the end of 46, he ends up leaving the Cardinals because I don't know. I couldn't figure it out. It looks like it was kind of a money thing. He asked for more money, and they were like, no. So I think it may have even been at the end
Won
of
the World Series in '46 too.
it may have been at 45 actually.
Okay.
I'd have to go check to see who the manager was in 46. But Southworth
I'm not
leaving
sure
the
either.
Cardinals is, if you want to talk about the rise and fall, I think Southworth leaving the Cardinals is part of the fall, part of the reason that they didn't win in the late 40s. In fact, he went to the Braves, took a sort of so team, and turned them into pennant winners in 1948. One of Billy Southworth's other negative traits is he was a heavy drinker. And by the time he was with the Braves, he was drinking pretty strongly. And in fact, at one point, he's either 49 or 50, he had to leave and take a leave of absence from his managing position to go sober up. And they had an interim manager for a little while. So that may have been part of the reason he left the Cardinals also. Because in 1946, they weren't yet owned by Anheuser-Busch. They're owned by, as we said before, Sam Beaton. Two people in the chat. Sam Breeden. I'm sorry. Sam Breeden was the owner.
Yep.
Both
Alex shared that, and also Baseball Time Traveler shared that as well.
So that was the name that I couldn't come up with. Sam Breeden, who also, in the end of the 40s, sold the team to an ownership group that included a guy who went to jail for tax evasion. And then they had to end up selling the team to Anheuser-Busch in like 53 or 54. So the end of the 40s were a little bit of a mess for the Cardinals in many respects, in management and ownership.
Yeah, I mean, the last time they finished first place in this era was 1946. And that was the year they ended up facing Ted Williams and the Red Sox in the World Series. And I think that series is known for two things, if I can reflect on it in my knowledge and understanding of it. One is how poorly Ted Williams played, who was injured at the time going into the World Series. And he often gets a lot of grief about like underperforming during the World Series. And that's the reason, like the Red Sox didn't dominate the Cardinals. But like Stan Musial also didn't have a great World Series either for that one. But the other part is really the mad dash, which getting back to Slaughter was the big play that won the World Series in the decisive game, where he ran all the way from first base all the way to home, I believe on was it a ball, just simple ball to the outfield, but it was kind of lazily thrown into the infield, and kind of then the relay was much delayed, and Slaughter just blew through the sign at third base and just came barreling home and scored. And then the Cardinals took the lead and eventually obviously won the game. So.
The hit was by, I believe, Harry the Hat Walker.
It is. Yeah, that's right. Good memory. Yes.
Who was one of the racists on the team. Slaughter was not. But Harry Walker and his brother Dixie Walker, who was sold by the Dodgers because they didn't want him on the same team as Robinson. But anyway, Harry the Hat Walker was a great hitter, slap hitter, hit a single. It was actually ruled a double, but everybody says, he wasn't going to make second other than the fact that they threw the ball home. He went to second on the throw. Slaughter was running with the pitch. And Pesky, that's right. Signs of the past time. Pesky, I was thinking. I was trying to remember who it was. Like double clutched on the throw, and made the throw home, and Slaughter beat it. So the mad dash is forever a piece of American baseball history, and it won them the World Series. The interesting,
actually because they didn't appear in a World Series again until 1967 when they played the St. Louis Cardinals again, and the St. Louis Cardinals won the World Series that year. And the manager, obviously, for the St. Louis Cardinals is actually pictured right here in the middle, and that's Red Shandy. And kind of getting back a little bit to him, like he's a treasure in the St. Louis area, just for not only his time as a player, but all the work that he did with the team and managed there afterwards. So he was an active player with St. Louis for 10 seasons through 1956, and then came back again through 61 to 63. 10-time All-Star, 9 times with the Cardinals, won 2 World Series, one with St. Louis, and then he has one in Milwaukee, as you kind of mentioned. He had just over 2,400 hits. But what really put him as a good candidate for the Hall of Fame was the time he spent on the bench. when he managed the team in 65 all the way through 76, and they made 2 appearances in the World Series and won one of them. And probably should have won the second one, but that's it. We're not covering the Tigers or the
Yeah.
Cardinals in the 60s at this point. So,
Yeah. So, what was the other thing I was going to bring up? Oh, yes, we talked about this. The other major thing that I think is the problem with the Cardinals late 40s into the 50s is the fact that Branch Rickey left the team at the end of the 41 season. And
you're seeing
there
your
we go.
cards.
Yeah, so that's the Stan Musial, the Burke Ross. That picture is used for a lot of different. I think it's also used for his Bond bread card.
Very similar image, if not the same one. Yeah.
Yeah, and then there's Pepper Martin that I showed before, the Marty Marion, and then Eddie Stanky, who becomes the manager after Marty Marion is let go and goes across town to the Browns. Eddie Stanky, I think, manages for 3 or 4 seasons. Stanky managed. That's the other thing. Stanky managed Slaughter and never said anything negative about him, even though Stanky had been Jackie Robinson's teammate. So I think that the concept that Slaughter was a racist is kind of, there's a lot of different circumstantial evidence that it's not true. So what I was going to get to, though, is that Rickey left the Cardinals. If Rickey had stayed with the Cardinals throughout the 40s, there's a pretty good chance that the Cardinals may have had, if not Jackie Robinson, they may have had other African-American players. And the problem with the Cardinals, it's very similar to the Red Sox, is that they didn't have any of the players that came after. They didn't get Monty Irvin or Roy Campanella or Don Newcomb or any of those all-star Hall of Fame quality players because they didn't have Rickey, and they didn't have the wherewithal to go ahead and pick up players. So they were undermanned in the late 40s and into the 50s. Their first African-American player doesn't come in until Alston comes in, and his first game is 1954. So it's 7 or 8 seasons that the Cardinals do not have an African-American player, and I think that hurts them the same way it hurt the Red Sox.
Yeah, that was my thinking around that too, is they were slow to integrate. And I'm not sure what the politics may have been with the Cardinals at the time. It was obviously with the other team in town, it wasn't an issue. I mean, Bill Veeck was very much trying to get teams to integrate well before they actually happened. And, the other owners didn't like him, for wanting to do that. And so he kind of wasn't able to buy the Phillies in like the 30s he wanted to integrate then, and wasn't able to be successful in purchasing the team. And by the time obviously Jackie Robinson came into the game, he was like, okay, who can we bring in to Cleveland? And then after he left Cleveland, he came over to St. Louis with the Browns, and then he's like, okay, I'm going to bring Satchel Paige with me here too. And so they seem to be much more receptive with the Browns being able to integrate, but the Cardinals took their time. And when they started getting good again, it was because of the minority players that they had on the team.
Absolutely.
They're stars, previous to that era. Musial was kind of still around, but like he was aging. And a lot of their other players, Red Shandy's came back, was also aging, and neither of them were part of the World Series team in 1964. I mean, Shandy's was a coach, but that was the capacity. He was with the team at that point. So,
well, you mentioned Shandy's and Musial were both in favor of integration and were quite quite friendly with all of the African American players in the major leagues. So Musial is a great guy across the board, and Shandy's of course was too, and ended up managing 2 of the greatest players in Cardinals history are Lou Brock and Bob Gibson. So that I think that you're right. As soon as they got black players, they became good. It's almost like
obviously they had like Flood come in, Bill
Right.
White come in right around a similar time. There's a couple other ones that kind of came up and joined the team around that too, and just kind of changed the whole way they played. By the time they reached 64 and were a surprise team to reach the World Series and surprised to beat the Yankees during the World Series at that time.
Yeah, 64.
Who also were slow to integrate too, but they had the best team in baseball at that point still.
So I think
so those were your cards. Here's the rest of your cards that you kind of shared with me, and we kind of went through some of them. So
there's the Stan. Well, there's of course the Musial, the 48 all the way to the 54. Yeah, I've shown all these. The 41 Mize. I also have the hard to say what Mize this is because it's the square cornered. It was sold to me as a square cornered Bond bread, which neither SGC nor CGC or PSA grade these anymore because they're supposed to have rounded corners. There's also a theory that these are not actually even Bond bread cards, that they were cards that were issued with a playing card set. There's also the possibility that this is part of the find that was made in the 1980s. So I don't even know if this is a legitimate card, and I never will probably. But it's Johnny Mize in the Giants uniform, circa mid to late 40s. He came back from the war, and was crushing it. 50 some home runs, two home
Yeah,
run
I think he
titles.
won
You know,
2 more home run titles, right?
yeah,
I think when
I
he came
think
back. I know at least tied one with Kiner. Yeah.
if he had been on the Cardinals around that time frame, things would have been probably a little different. Of course, they won it in 46, but they faded in 47, 48. They were a third
Yeah.
place team, and that was about it.
Have
Right?
it right here in front of me. Here's their finishes up to the point where they had in 1954, their first losing season
Right.
since 1937. They were second again in 47. And Medwick had briefly rejoined the team during that time span. And, it was just kind of barely like being able to stay on a roster at this point in his career. 48, they were second place again. 49, they were second place again. But they did have the first of the 3 Boyer brothers join the team as a pitcher during that time period. But he was unfortunately the least productive of the 3 in that point. Then they dropped all the way to 5th in 1950, which is where that picture was from with
Yeah.
the 1950 season. So I imagine that was probably pretty startling for fans of the team to see him drop that far off. But they never really were built on real solid pitching during the late 40s into the 50s. And we mentioned, obviously, they were very slow to integrate, despite being a team that was most close to Kansas City and probably could have gotten a lot of the Monarch players if they were just a little more aggressive.
Yeah.
So what we're kind of left with, as like fans of the Cardinals' era, is just some of the baseball cards of these great players that started in the 40s, had their probably best years in the 40s that kind of were still just around, doing baseball. So here's like 3 of my cards, 52 tops cards of Slaughter and Shandy's, which show them with a stadium backdrop, which is really cool. I think in both of them, I think it's probably Sportsman's Park. Not entirely sure because the background images just aren't very clear of the stadiums in the 52s. And then obviously the same card that you shared earlier, mine in a little bit less nice condition, but I love it nevertheless.
Mitchell, I'm not going to tell you what I spent on it. It's painful for me to even think about it, but I paid about the right price for it, which if you go check the comps is a heavy price. But that 52 Slaughter, the 52 top Slaughter, that is a fantastic card. I don't know why I don't own that. I should.
It was the first graded 52 tops card I got. I had some ungraded commons. Yeah. It's actually pretty affordable too. For anybody looking to pick that one up.
The color on that is fantastic.
And so is the red. Red is also pretty inexpensive.
Red's a nice card with the stadium behind him. That is terrific. Yep. 52
Dan is
tops. I've always felt that it was overrated, but I'm starting to feel like that I was the one who was missing the boat on this. And I've done a show on 52 tops, and I only have at this point about 10 of them. But
the more I've acquired, the more I love it. Yeah, I think
exactly.
For some reason, I think this is also why I'm a set collector. I think sometimes when you see cards in isolation from sets, they can be beautiful, but sometimes when you put them in context of the entire set of how it was envisioned, I think that's sometimes when you really see the genius in the card's design, especially these cards that are from like the vintage era that are more like art kind of cards. You can kind of see how they kind of all fit together and support one another. Yeah, so that's just kind of like my take on it, and that's why I've enjoyed looking at all the different 52s, and I love the horizontal cards in the 52 set. I think they are far superior than the vertical ones in the way that they're kind of designed and laid out. They're just fantastic. When you hold one in your hand, you kind of see the level of detail that's in that image.
I have the Mize is the 52 tops Mize is a vertical card, and that's one of the ones that I do have because I collect him. I collected
did those earlier.
Oh,
So
there we
yeah,
go.
here's the Mize.
There
Yeah.
you-
Yeah, it's a pretty interesting image because it's like he's got this glowing sky behind him
Yeah,
in there, and I think they did obviously a bang up job on all the Yankees at that time. Obviously probably being located near New York, they're going to obviously like probably try and get a lot of kids of the fans of the Yankees and the Dodgers and the Giants to want to gravitate and buy those cards, right? But so might as well make nice images. And then there's like a Red Shandy later card, 56. This is his last card as a Cardinal until he came back to them in the early 60s, where you see him pictured
yeah,
on like I think just the 62 card. So I don't think he has a 63 and a 61. He's in a Milwaukee uniform still.
right.
That one, even though he was traded to the Cardinals that year. Yeah, they tailed off pretty bad after 1950 because they dropped to fifth. They got back up to third in 51, but only won 81 games. So it must have probably been a distant third, I'm guessing. They were third once again in 52, did a little bit better, got 88 wins that year. Then they got 83 wins in 53, were third place, and then they crashed and were only won 72 games in 1954. And that was kind of like the end of sort of the Cardinals until we got to the 1960s when they really kind of reloaded and went ahead and integrated. So here's a couple more of my cards I have in here. The last playing day cards of Mize outside of like the 53 Bowman black and white card, which I don't have.
Yeah, I have that.
Like to have it at some point. And then obviously the 63 Topps Unusual, which actually is my favorite Topps card of him. Just kind of like the image, and it's not just because it's autographed, but that really was a bonus for me.
Yeah, no, he did sign a lot. But I actually have this 62 card. I've got all the Topps cards of Unusual. There aren't that many of them. I think there's only
No, yeah.
58, 59, 60, 61, 62, 63. So there's 6 of them. I like the 62 with the batting stance. But yeah, this 63 is a nice one. I have pretty high grade of that. I think maybe a 6. And my
Oh wow, that really pops then.
Yeah, it really does. And yeah, I have all the Mize flagships, so that's another one that I'm happy I have in like a 5, I think also. But he yeah, this is his last card. The 53 Bowman black and white is obviously not a great card because it's black and white. If he had been in the color set, it would have been much better. But yeah, that's the end of Mize from there. Yeah.
Yeah. What I like about this card is just like when I look at this card, I'm like, this is what a vintage baseball card should look like.
Yeah.
That's what kind of like the first thing that comes to my mind. It's like perfect in every way. I kind of like the portrait shots for a lot of the cards as well. I just think it's a beautiful card. And it's also one that's pretty affordable. I think I picked this one up for, $50. That wasn't too bad.
Yeah,
It's got super sharp corners. It's just miscut top to bottom. That's why I was able to get it the price I did, but it's not like gross miscut where it's like you have part of the next card on it.
When I was finishing the Mize flagship run, I was shocked at how cheap some of his cards were. Like I got like the 52 Bowman for $45 or something in like a 6. It was like, really? It sounds unfair. But I think Mize has picked up a little bit as people have gotten a little smarter. I was doing his flagship run at this point like 4 or 5 years ago, so I think prices have gone up a little bit.
I use his name a lot to answer questions on the Immaculate Grid, and kind of be show sort of evidence of just like how popular he is. Whenever I put his name down, so how it kind of works is like you get obscurity scores. So like the more popular score you get, you have a higher score, and you want to get a low score. So you want like an obscurity score of like only 1% of people pick this player, so that's get 1 point for that item versus like 50
times a week. So I'm aware.
And when I put them on there, it's always like a 1%. 1 or 2% of people endorse like Johnny Mize, whether I put him down as a Giant, a Yankee, or a Cardinal, depending on what the question is. Which is interesting, right? Because he's the star of the 53 World Series, and star of the Cardinals, star of the Giants, big teams. People, but he's kind of been forgotten in many ways. Whereas Unusual, it's always a high percentage whenever you put him down.
Yeah, no, Musial's like one of those guys who's 35, except for, he pitched. So
Yeah, whenever I use him, it's like he pitched one game in the majors.
so
Usual.
but yeah, no, I know what you're saying. A lot of people don't remember that Johnny Mize is on the Cardinals, so you can get immaculate grid, good immaculate grid scores for like Cardinals with over 300 home runs. You put in Mize and you get 2% or whatever. So, yep. So what do we got?
Before we kind of wrap up here, just wanted to see, if there's any questions for Dan from the audience, especially if it's their first time seeing Dan. Feel free to kind of add them into the chat. But otherwise, we'll kind of move into our little bit of our recap. But would love to hear some feedback in the comments once this video posts. Just if you kind of like a discussion about sort of the teams and the teammates during that era, because it's a kind of a different take of where we could go, and obviously share cardboard to go along with it, as well as photographs if we have those. I think it was kind of fun putting it together. And Dan, I really want to thank you for agreeing to be on the channel to be able to help me do this. So.
I appreciate you having me on, Mitch, and I have to say that picture that your dad got in 1950 is really, part of my collection, I feel like, is something that has a family connection. So the 48 Braves thing for me is because of multiple family connections. The same thing with me collecting like Tommy Holmes, because that was my father's favorite player, or collecting other cards because they were, my brothers got me this or that, or, some connection to the family. And I feel like I don't smoke cigars, Jason. I'm sorry. I feel like this picture is part of the reason why, you collect. I feel like, it's one of those things where this means something to you more than anything that, like, if you try to sell it for $50 or whatever, it's priceless to you.
Yeah.
So
there was one other picture I meant to add too. I actually forgot to do that. This is actually like, so this is my father that's next to me, not Fred Bird. He's not my dad. Despite what people might say, because we're wearing similar outfits at the moment. But this was like from last spring. I was down running a half marathon in St. Louis, and we ended up running into Fred Bird in the lobby of the hotel, which was next to the stadium. And then it was game day. So we took the picture together. My dad was there watching me for the race. But, he's like kind of was my connection, to the Cardinals, to baseball in general. But I mean, he and I still talk about baseball to this day, and it's usually about his Cardinals. Sometimes I can get him to talk a little bit about my White Sox. Right now, it's just been, what's going on with your White Sox? Which is a legitimate question. I don't know what's going on with my White Sox. They're kind of messy. But now I can say the same about his team. But between that family story, of the game that my grandfather, who I never met because he passed before I was born, took my dad and his brother to a game, and they took this as the souvenir that day. It was probably the giveaway. To obviously, this picture just most recently when we were down in St. Louis and actually went to a game too. It's like there's a family connection, with the Cardinals, even though I did become a White Sox fan. But
no, that is a great picture. Good for you. I mean, that's it. The hobby should mean a lot of things to you. It shouldn't just be, certainly not just about money, because that's meaningless. It has family connections. It's art. It's history. It's, just feeling like you have part of Americana in your apartment or in your home or whatever. And, it's also the community too. One of the things that I experienced, I've experienced a lot of baseball card community over the years. I've had friends that I collected with even when I was like, my teens and my 20s. But that Strongsville show, where a bunch of guys got together and there was something like 50 content creators came and stayed in the same hotel and did like a Friday night get together, and then walked the floor together. And, just feeling like these are people of kindred spirits makes you also feel pretty good about, what you have in your collection. So, those are the important things. If it's about family connections, art, history, and community. So to me, that's what the hobby's all about.
Yeah, that's part of the reason I collect Musial, is because my dad's favorite player.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think my grandfather's favorite player was maybe Dizzy Dean. Yeah, but I don't have any Dizzy Dean cards yet at this
I
point.
have the 33 Dean back here
Yeah.
somewhere. So
I have the book, The Gas House Gang, which we didn't actually go over today, but it's got Dizzy Dean on the cover right there. So that's a good read too. You know, it talks about the Gas House Gang team. So
Yep.
Well, I'd like to thank you again, you know, for agreeing to be on the channel. It was a pleasure, you know,
Yep.
kind of doing something with you again, and looking forward to collaborating again in the future around other topics that we can take an interest in. So,
Definitely.
right, with that said, any closing remarks for the audience, Dan, before you want to maybe talk about where people can find you again one more time? So,
Yeah, it's at DansVintageBaseballPC, and I do shows pretty much every Saturday. Occasionally, I do shows during the week, and I will see a lot of people at the National. I think that's my next major show. Already saving up money for it, so we'll be walking the floor at the National. Hopefully, meeting up with tons and tons of people. Mitchell, you coming to the National? I think I heard you.
I won't be there this year. I have a little hometown advantage. It's here every other year, so I'm a little spoiled, so I can just wait.
Yeah, I didn't go last year because my wife and I went to Hawaii, and she booked the dates.
That's a good reason.
Before I had a chance
Yeah.
to say anything, so we were flying over Chicago at the time of the in our Hawaii flight at the time of the.
It's a fun place to go. I've been there a few times myself.
No, I went to school in the Midwest, so I know I've been to Chicago many times, and I'd like to go back again next year.
Yeah, we'll see who's in town. Maybe we can, a few of us can get to a game. I'm happy to kind of coordinate that, whether it be on the north side or the south side. Yeah, tickets will be cheaper and more available on the south side, but
I think 3 or 4 times to Wrigley Field. I never went to Comiskey, which is one of my big regrets. But yeah, I could have gone to Comiskey in like the 80s or 90s, but I didn't. So, oh well.
The old Comiskey would have been a nice thing to see.
Yeah. Oh well.
It was fun when I went there. All right. Well, that's it for tonight, guys. Thanks for everybody staying in the chat and adding comments as we went through. It was much appreciated. So we'll see you all soon.
Thanks, guys.